This is Mr. Dryer coming to you live from Inchville High School with another AP government lesson. Today we're going to talk about the powers of the president. As usual, I put in a few clippings from the AP curriculum to keep us on task, so we might as well just jump right into this. Up here in the first slide in the corner, we see, straight from the AP curriculum, formal and informal powers of the president include vetoes and pocket vetoes, formal powers that enable the president to check Congress. Now, here's my advice. If you get an AP test question where it talks about how can the president check the power of Congress, your go-to answer is the power of the veto. Let's get into this a little bit, though. Remember, Congress means the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 senators, and the House has 435 representatives. Remember the lesson on how a bill becomes a law. A bill can go through the House or the Senate, but it has to pass with a majority. So half the senators plus one and half of the members of the House plus one would vote to approve the bill. Then this bill would go to the president. The president could A, sign the bill, or B, veto the bill. There are a couple different types of vetoes. There's the regular veto, and then there is the pocket veto. The pocket veto, as you can see here, means that the bill is put on the president's desk, and he does not sign it within 10 days. And within that 10 days, Congress adjourns. Adjourns means go on vacation, basically. And there are several times during a session, and a session is a year of Congress, that they would adjourn. That does not happen frequently because you would have to have the right circumstances to be able to pocket veto something. A pocket veto is better than a veto because a pocket veto cannot be overridden, whereas a veto can. Now let's say the president vetoes a bill. It would go back to Congress, and then 2/3 of the senators and 2/3 of the House would have to agree to override the veto. This happens very rarely because it's difficult to get 2/3 of the Senate or the House to agree on anything. There are a couple of other things the president can do when a bill comes to his desk. One thing he can do is just ignore it. So within 10 days he doesn't sign it, and Congress does not adjourn, it will just automatically become a law. And the other thing he can do is sign the bill into law and affix a signing statement at the bottom, which we will go over in one of the next slides. Let's go ahead and look at this diagram here. I think it's important to look at charts and to look at diagrams and pictures because these will be on the AP test, and we have to be able to interpret these things and to read into them and to come to conclusions based on these charts or graphs. So right here I have presidential vetoes and bills passed in Congress. As you can see, it goes from Truman to the first term of Obama's presidency. And we see that the blue means that this would be a Democrat. The red is a Republican president. And down here, we see bills passed in Congress and presidential vetoes. Down here, you can see in Truman's presidency, there were 250 total vetoes, and in Eisenhower's 181, and so on. Now, what can we really get from this chart? What information could we get from it? What trends could we get from it? Well, we could say that, first of all, vetoes over time have declined. You can see that there were many more vetoes 60, 70 years ago than right now. And we can also say that it depends on the president and who controls Congress. So if we look at Obama, this doesn't give us the information here, but during his first 2 years, the Senate and the House were also Democratic. And we've gone over a term for that, which is unified government. So if the president and both chambers of Congress are of the same party, it's very likely that they're going to work together to get bills passed. If bills are being passed, then there won't be as many vetoes. Although this is sort of interesting because we can see that fewer bills were getting passed under these couple of years here, when you would think that more bills would be getting passed. So besides vetoes, and there's a direct result of vetoes becoming less frequent because as it looks here, there are fewer bills being passed by Congress. So if fewer bills are being passed by Congress, we could say that maybe Congress is just much more divided now. It's more partisan than ever before. It's much more unlikely that both chambers of Congress will compromise or the president will compromise with Congress to get a bill passed into law. And that is actually something the textbook talks about. All right, moving on. Foreign policy. Both formal, commander-in-chief and treaties, and informal, executive agreements. Now, I've seen quite a few questions on AP tests about the powers of the president. And one thing they like to ask is, what are some powers the president has to conduct foreign policy? And normally students remember commander-in-chief, and they also remember this idea of the president being able to negotiate treaties. However, they often forget, besides commander-in-chief, I'll just put CMC, and treaties, the president can also appoint ambassadors. So these are three things right here that are actually in the Constitution. And by the way, I should say that when it says formal, it means in the Constitution. On an AP test, sometimes the question will specifically say, list some powers the president has in the Constitution. Or it might say list some powers the president has that have developed over time. And students often miss these questions because they're not looking at the question close enough. Okay. Another thing the president can do is basically sign executive agreements. Executive agreements are kind of like treaties, but they do not require a vote in the Senate. A formal treaty must have a vote in the Senate, whereas an executive agreement is much like an executive order where the president can just sign this agreement with another country. And I'm showing you this chart here because, as you can see, it's actually much more common that a president will sign an executive agreement with another country than a treaty. In fact, we could say treaties are relatively uncommon compared to executive agreements. Now, the next question is why? Well, first of all, the president would not require the consent of the Senate, which is important. And secondly, nowadays there actually are a lot of agreements that we have with other countries that require secrecy. They might be about stationing special forces in different countries, about having specific military listening posts in other countries, about sensitive military information. And if that is the case, you really don't want to have a full vote on the Senate floor because then all that information will be public and it will no longer be secret. Plus, you could say an executive agreement is just quicker and much more efficient. So many of these executive agreements, if they were treaties, would be confirmed by the Senate anyway. But it's just easier and faster to write an executive agreement. Now remember, executive agreements are not in the Constitution, whereas the power of a treaty is in the Constitution. All right, another power of the president is the bargaining and persuasion power. I didn't really put a chart or a picture because there's nothing to really chart, but we could talk about this for a moment. How can the president persuade people to get something done? Well, actually, I've read about a number of presidents who would call specific congressmen into his office when it looked like they weren't going to vote a certain way on a bill and talk to them privately. In fact, the president would have a list of these people that he would need, and then he would call all of them separately into his office. It's sort of like being called into the principal's office. It's a little uncomfortable. And yes, the president really can't do anything to a representative or a senator who does not want to vote a certain way, but the president can certainly put pressure on them, especially if that representative or senator is of the same party. The president could also offer this person specific favors. The president could say, you know what do you really want? Do you want some more money for your state? Is there something we can do for you? And there actually is a term called log rolling, although this has to do more with members of Congress. So what this means is, hey, if I vote for you this time on this bill, then you have to vote for me next time. But we could sort of extrapolate this to the president. The president could say, you know what? If you support me on this policy initiative I have, next time you have something that you want to do, I'm going to try to give you my full support on that bill. And, when we talk about policy initiatives, what are we talking about? It could be anything. For instance, Trump wanted to build a wall on the border, so that's a policy initiative dealing with border control and immigration. Obama wanted to pass health care. That's a policy initiative about, obviously bringing health care to people. Okay, we're probably going to talk more about that more later, but let's move on. All right, the president has the ability to write executive orders. Here from the AP curriculum, we see executive orders implied from the president's vested executive power or from power delegated by Congress. The fact is, ever since the beginning of this country, presidents have written executive orders to carry out the day-to-day business of the government. Now, in general, there's this idea that an executive order is a directive to a part of the executive branch. So the president is directing a federal agency to do a certain thing. But over time, the idea of an executive order has increased in power. And presidents have used them quite a bit to yet again enact policy initiatives. One example might be President Trump using an executive order to ban people coming to America from certain Muslim countries that were seen as a security risk. But that's just one example. An executive order can be used for a lot of things. Now, the reason we have this chart here is because I wanted to show you that actually executive orders are less frequent today than they were around the 1930s and 40s. So oftentimes in the news, you'll hear people complaining about how the president is ruling by executive order. It's unconstitutional. Republicans complained about Obama. Democrats complained about Trump. It's always the same argument. But in the end, we can see that in general, Republican and Democratic presidents seem to use about equal amounts of executive orders. In fact, Republicans on average have used slightly more over time, but not many. And Democrats on average a little bit less. And yes, it depends on the president, but as you can see, we have Obama here, Bush here, Clinton here. They've all used executive orders. This here says the current rate is 0.09 executive orders per day. So executive orders are not uncommon. They are used frequently, but they are not in the Constitution. One question might be, how can you check the power of an executive order? This just seems to be some unilateral move that the president is doing, just sort of assuming power to make some sort of executive order or, law. But here's a good answer on any AP test. If Congress does something or the president does something, say Congress and the president pass a law, say the president signs an executive order or even an executive agreement, the check is always the federal courts. Somebody will sue, could be an interest group, could be a group of people. They will say that the executive order, the executive agreement, or the law is not constitutional, and they're going to point out some part of the Constitution is breaking. Very likely it could be the 14th Amendment, which has an equal protection clause, due process clause, so on. Or they'll point out a specific part of the Constitution, and then the courts will make a decision about whether it is legal or not, whether it is constitutional or not. That's always a great answer to put on an AP test. Don't forget the courts. They are there for that specific reason. All right, moving on. Here are some more executive orders. And I wanted to show you this because I often ask my students, what is the drawback of an executive order? it seems like it's all upside. The president can write this executive order that has the force of a law without the agreement of Congress. And the one thing I always point out is that executive orders are impermanent. What that means is, for an executive order to be repealed, all it takes is a new president to sign an executive order repealing all of a previous president's executive orders. So your executive orders will really probably only be in force during your presidency. Okay, now think about a bill that becomes a law. Let's think about the Affordable Care Act that Obama passed, the health care bill. After the Republicans took the presidency in 2016, Trump, and they also had both houses of Congress, they still were not able to repeal this bill. Because what do you need to do to repeal a bill that has become a law? Well, you have to have both chambers of Congress agree to repeal the bill and the president to agree. And the fact is, there were enough Republicans in the House that did not want to repeal health care, that did not agree with their own party. So it's actually pretty difficult to repeal a bill that has become a law. You need a majority in both houses and the president, and sometimes that's not even enough. If you look at this, this shows presidents from Roosevelt up to Obama. And this says number of executive orders revoked by president since FDR. So when Obama became president, he revoked a bunch of executive orders written by Bush, So they're revoking executive orders. Reagan revoked a lot of executive orders. So, basically you're revoking everything the previous president has done. You're erasing everything they have done, their legacy. So most presidents would prefer to pass a law, take a bill and make it into law because it is more permanent. All right, signing statements. Signing statements are an informal power. They are not really in the Constitution, but over time, presidents sometimes will write additional comments at the bottom of a bill when they sign it. Now, why would they do that? Well, let's go ahead and read this here. Signing statements have been used since the early 19th century by presidents to comment on the law being signed. Such comments can include giving the president's interpretation of the meaning of the law's language, asserting objections to certain provisions of the law on constitutional grounds, and stating the president's intent regarding how the president intends to execute or carry out the law. Well, there's a lot going on there, but remember, the president is the executive branch, and in the Constitution, the president has a duty to faithfully execute the laws that are passed by Congress. That doesn't always happen. Also, the president might say, you know what, I know that this bill, if I veto it, will be overturned, will be overridden. But I'm going to put a signing statement on here and say, I don't agree with this bill. I don't agree with these parts of this bill for these reasons. But I'm going to have to sign it anyway, so I'm going to do that. And down here, we see signing statements over time. I just wanted to give you an idea of how many of these things are done. And we see it by Congress. So we have Bush, then Clinton, and then the second Bush. So we see that signing statements are relatively common. Here's the bills passed, 498, and Bush put a signing statement on 49 of them. Now, we don't know what those bills are about, but we could say that Bush probably had some issue with at least these 49 bills. Maybe he thought there was some provision in there that was unconstitutional. Maybe he thought the bill was lessening the power of the executive branch. There's a lot of reasons, we could do research on some of these, but just keep in mind that signing statements can be a tool that are used to basically, the president will use them to let people know what he thinks about specific legislation. All right, so the next part of this AP curriculum talks about potential conflicts between the president and the Senate. Now, keep in mind the Senate must approve or confirm. It's called the confirmation power by a majority many of the presidential appointments. So the president can appoint not only Supreme Court justices, those are the ones we always talk about, but he can appoint the heads of all of the cabinet level departments. There's about 3,000 people the president can appoint, and about 12 or 1,300 that have to be confirmed by the Senate. And oftentimes this is where the conflict comes in. Now, also, you could say it depends. In Trump's case, the Senate was controlled by Republicans. So there really wasn't as much of a conflict. For instance, during the end of Trump's term, he appointed a new Supreme Court Justice in Coney Barrett. And that went through the Senate very rapidly because they had no problem with having a more conservative Supreme Court Justice on the court. But it might be a problem if, let's just say in the future, Biden is going to be president, but the Senate might still be Republican. We don't know at the time of me making this video because there's going to be some special elections in Georgia. But let's just say that the Senate is still going to be Republican. Well, think about it. When Biden has to appoint people to the Supreme Court, if it happens, if he has to appoint people to be in charge of the FBI, the CIA, or all of these other agencies, he has to get basically 50 senators, because he could always have the vice president cast a tie-breaking vote, to agree. Okay? And so if there's 51 or 52 Republicans and they constantly disagree with him and they don't approve or confirm his appointments, that's going to be a source of conflict and tension in government. And then Biden is going to have to also maybe find people who are not as liberal as he would like them to be to satisfy a couple of Republican senators to get the votes that he needs to get the people confirmed. So that's what this is saying here. Remember, the cabinet members are the people in charge of the cabinet level departments, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. There's 15 of those. Any ambassadors and White House staff. So there's a lot of people. I mean, think about Biden is going to have to ask for approval from the Senate for some people on his own staff. Okay, over here, Senate confirmation is an important check on appointment powers, but the president's longest lasting influence lies in life tenured judicial appointments. We've talked about this several times, but in Trump's case, he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, which is a lot in 4 years. And those Supreme Court justices are going to be there until they quit, die, or that's about it. They can't be removed, so it's for life. And so the impact of those 3 Supreme Court justices will be felt long after Trump is not in office anymore. So judicial appointments are important. And besides, it's not just the Supreme Court. Remember, there are also many lower federal courts. So Trump actually appointed probably, hundreds of judges that we didn't talk about. And Obama also, and all the presidents before him. So that could really take the entire court to be more conservative for the next 10, 20 years or more liberal, it just depends. And for instance, the court actually has been pretty liberal for about 20 years, 30 years, at least moderately, so it might be swinging back to conservative. It's hard to say. Okay, policy initiatives and executive orders promoted by the president often lead to conflict with Congress. Of course, we know that if the president wants to do things that are different than what Congress wants to do, there will be conflict. For instance, Trump wanted to build a wall and have stricter immigration regulations, and Congress really did not want to. It's a source of conflict. Okay, don't forget the 22nd Amendment, which put term limits on the presidency. This happened after FDR, basically because no president had been elected that many terms before. The most have been 2 terms. FDR was elected 4 terms. He died in the sort of beginning of his 4th term. But there was this idea that the president's job is so powerful that there should be at least a term limit. So they put 2 4-year terms on it. By the way, they don't have to be consecutive. So for instance, Grover Cleveland, this is before the 22nd Amendment, but Grover Cleveland was president. I think he was the 22nd president. Then he lost, and then he was the 24th president. So theoretically, Trump could lose and then not be president for 4 years and then be elected again. It is possible, but we'll see what happens. All right, and the last thing, by the way, all this is also in Chapter 7, and you really should read the chapter to get more background information and look at the PowerPoint. The chapter is critical. But the last thing in here is modern technology, social media, and how the president can use these things to sort of promote his policy goals. And also, there is a yearly State of the Union address or message. And you see this thing here says bully pulpit. A bully pulpit is just a saying. What that means is the president has this ability to get his message out there. Because if you are the president, if you say something, people will notice, people will pay attention. Just look at Trump's tweets. We see how many times he tweeted over 4 years. When he tweeted, it got everyone's attention. It got his base, his followers' attention, the Republican Party's attention, but also the attention of the opposition and the media and everybody else. And President Trump was pretty savvy about using Twitter to his advantage. And I think most presidents will be doing this in the future, because using Twitter bypasses the traditional media. And according to Trump, the traditional media was very biased and very liberal and didn't like him. So it was a way of him getting his message directly out to the people. So if you look at modern technology such as social media, mainly Twitter, but you could say Facebook or any of these other things out there, these are being used a lot more by people in charge, not just Trump, but like governors of the states, but definitely by presidents. The State of the Union is important. It's a speech that's sort of broadcast every year and people pay attention to it. And really what the president does is outline his goals and initiatives for the upcoming year. Like I said, bully pulpit is just sort of an informal term, but pulpit is what would be in front of a church. And I think this term was coined by Theodore Roosevelt, who said the presidency was like a bully pulpit. And really what he meant by it was, if the president is going to speak, people are going to pay attention. So it gives the president a lot of power to try to convince people to put pressure on Congress to vote for certain bills and try to convince people that what the president is doing should be supported. All right, well, that's sort of the basics, and this is sort of the basic info that is in the AP curriculum. I think it should help you understand the powers the president has as they're in the Constitution and as they have developed over time, but also should help you understand some checks on the president's power and also some checks the president has on Congress or the federal bureaucracy or even the courts. All right, good luck, study hard, and be successful.